Hello and welcome back to Bookish, and welcome back to another Random Thought Thursday. I'm not sure this is actually going to become a feature on my channel, but I've been having a lot of random thoughts. I don't know if this is an aging process thing. I don't know, maybe my vitamins have kicked in, kind of a thing, but I've been having these kind of random thoughts. Now, just as a disclaimer going in, I don't claim that any of these thoughts are profound, nor do I claim that any of these thoughts are necessarily original. And I don't make any claims you're going to find any of this interesting. But, you know, it's my channel and I kind of get to do what I want. So I thought I would ramble here about some random thoughts. And these random thoughts were inspired by a video I saw on Gina Stanier's channel. And she was talking about highbrow, middlebrow, lowbrow literature and then trash. This was inspired by a number of videos that she'd seen as a part of the GarbAugust read-along that's going on, in which essentially the organizers, and I'll leave a list of the organizers down below. I'll tell you up front, I didn't make up the names given to the organizers in the list, so I'm just going to copy it directly from Criminali's list on his GarbAugust intro video, and I'll leave a link to his original video down below as well as to Gina's. But the GarbAugust people have basically set aside August to read trash, and that, and then some Shelley Swearingen's videos and some of Ollie's videos have led Gina to kind of wonder about how we categorize literature: highbrow, middlebrow, lowbrow, trash. And she came up with her own, I think, really excellent ways of looking at those things. But then she kind of asked, I think in her video, and maybe I'm making this up, Gina, I'm sorry if I am, she kind of asked if other people had ideas or how they did it. And that got me thinking about, you know, how I think about using those labels and how I apply those labels to different books and different works of literature, different pieces of writing. And then that got me thinking about where those terms came from, why they evolved, how that was affected by change in American society, how it really is a statement of class consciousness and snobbery, and how GarbAugust is this great event which is essentially waking, you know, book snobs, hopefully waking book snobs and you know, speaking to recovering book snobs about how we look at literature. So I'm going to try to connect all that together, not guarantee them will. So I'm going to start off by giving kind of what I think of as my definitions to highbrow, middlebrow, lowbrow, and trash in terms of writing. So first of all, I would say that to me, what sets aside a piece of writing, or I'm going to say a book, what sets aside a novel, I'm going to say a novel, what sets aside a novel as a work of literature is, does it aspire to be a work of art? Is its intent artistic? Is that its primary idea? Is that its primary motivation? It's not, that doesn't, you know, preclude telling a story, that doesn't preclude having a message, that doesn't preclude having a concept, but in some way that piece of writing is intended as art, something that speaks, you know, to the heart, to the mind, that affects emotion, you know, in kind of an artistic way, like looking at a painting. So, to me, highbrow literature attempts to be art. Now, middlebrow literature is where it becomes a lot more complicated, because what I would say about middlebrow literature is that middlebrow literature has a tendency to focus more on the issue of concept or entertainment. So, for instance, I think of science fiction. If I were going to use these labels, and I'll talk about why I don't in a minute, but if I were going to use these labels, I would classify science fiction as kind of middlebrow literature. Can science fiction be highbrow literature? It absolutely can. But I think as a group, and remember I'm kind of speaking generalizations, as a genre, I think it has a tendency to be more middlebrow literature, because I think science fiction is oftentimes based on a concept, an idea, a piece of technology, you know, a concept that is, you know, one of those things that humans aspire to, perhaps, like time travel or whatever. That there's a concept at the heart of science fiction that the author wants to explore, and exploring that concept is more important than necessarily creating art. At the same time, you know, I think middlebrow literature oftentimes attempts to be entertaining, but entertaining in a way which is, you know, not purely driven by tropes or repetition or that kind of comfort reading that we all go into just for pure entertainment purposes. I would call, if I were going to use these labels, and again I'll point out I really don't like these labels, if I were to use these labels, I would call literature that focuses, or a book that focuses on just pure entertainment, lowbrow literature, where if entertainment is the overriding concept, then I would call that lowbrow literature. And this would be, to me, genre-ridden work, genre work in which tropes and repeating tropes and following patterns are kind of the overriding concept, or the overriding force in those books. That people pick them up because they know what they're going to get, and that's what they want, is entertainment, without necessarily artiness, without necessarily big concept, but just kind of pure entertainment reading. I would call that lowbrow. I would call those books lowbrow books. And to me, a book that appeals strictly tries to titillate, that could be sexual stuff, or tries to attract our attention through violence or through some kind of gruesome thing happening, I would call that trash. Now, relax for just a second. I'm not saying true crime is trash, because I don't think that's what true crime attempts to do. I'm not saying that horror is trash, because that's certainly not what horror tries to do. I put horror novels in that kind of middlebrow section, that there's a concept at work there, even though a lot of horror novels might also fall into the lowbrow section by kind of repeating and regenerating these tropes because people, like what they're getting. So to me, the smallest category is actually trash, because I don't think there's a whole lot of writing, I might be wrong about this, that just really attempts to do nothing arty, to have no real concept, provide no entertainment outside of titillation or something like that. So if you ever seen Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, there's a scene in an airport where the Steve Martin character is sitting across from the John Candy character, and the John Candy character is reading essentially a porn novel. It's called Caged Heat or something like that. It's about women in prison. That to me is trash. Now, my definition of trash may be too narrow, but that to me is trash. A book about, that kind of makes serial killers seem like heroes, that might be trash. Something that, appeals to people's hate and promotes that hate. To me, that would be trash. So those are my relatively loose definitions of highbrow, middlebrow, lowbrow, and trash. Now, to be honest with you, I really don't like those terms, because those terms really were created to indicate snobbery, both snobbery against lowbrow literature and snobbery towards perhaps highbrow literature, and all of that came about because of greater class distinction and class awareness brought about by industrialization. So, one of the things Gina mentioned is she talked about a Jane Austen novel as being highbrow. I'm not going to argue with her about that. I think if we're looking at it today, which is of course the best way to look at it, then it is highbrow. But it's important to keep in mind, I think, that back in the day when Jane Austen was writing, and authors around that time period, they were writing for an audience of people much like themselves. Those were people who were educated and literate, and education and literacy rates were lower than they are today. So they were writing for a limited audience. They were writing for the top 10, 15, maybe 20% of the population in terms of education and free time and wealth. And so those things, I think, seem to us highbrow because they're written for that crowd, even though, to be honest with you, that's just kind of, I think, what popular literature had a tendency to be in the time period. So there was this time when few people could read, and few people could have had free time to read, and few people could afford to buy books so they could read. And that's kind of where we have this beginning of literature. Industrialization begins to change that. As Western Europe and the United States begin to industrialize, things really kind of begin to change. Industrialization draws people into cities. As we draw people into cities, because that's where factories are located, that means we have lots of families living in the cities with kids. That makes public education more possible. So when cities begin to grow, we see the growth of public education, in part because there are all these kids, and they're not necessarily needed for work as they might have been on a farm, and so they can be sent to school, and schools can be relatively local. They can walk there and back, with no trouble. Then we begin to see then this urbanization leads to increases in education. Industrialization not only leads to urbanization urbanization, but it also contributes to an increased need for educated workers in general, because the industrial workplace requires perhaps more education than more book education than farming would. So we see this kind of pressure and this buildup in the early to mid 19th century, more people going to school and more people getting an education, and therefore we have an emerging increasingly literate population. At the same time, publishing got a boost by improvements in paper making, which made it possible to print books at a much lower cost. And as soon as we begin printing books at a much lower cost for a population, or an increasing population of readers, we begin to see then different types of work are being produced for different people. We begin to see the popularization of things like, what we'll later call dime novels, or even the beginning of romance novels. These are kind of, at the time, were cheaply printed, formulaic, trope-heavy works that, middle class and working class people might have time and money to read, and education ability to read because of industrialization. And we begin to see this division between that kind of book and that kind of reading and what we might define as literature. And industrialization really then creates that. And as industrialization creates this growing middle class, and that's one of the things that industrialization created. As industrialization creates this growing middle class, we begin to see middle class people becoming incredibly class conscious. I used to tell my kids, middle class people tried to separate themselves from the poor and align themselves with the rich in terms of social habits, in terms of what they thought of as things that were classy, in terms of how they decorated their homes, or what kind of clothes they wore, or what kind of books they read. And so we begin to see the middle class, again, increasingly as education becomes more common and more middle class families can afford to send their kids to get better education, we begin to see this kind of division. And this really is where lowbrow and highbrow comes from. These kind of class distinctions that come into existence in the United States and in other places, separating, the things that the working class liked from the things that the wealthy and the middle class were supposed to like. So for instance, just to give you another example, working class Americans who lived in cities attended shows that we would call vaudeville shows with comedians and dancing girls and acrobats and, kind of bawdy little skits that were going on. Meanwhile, the upper class and the middle class who tried to imitate them were going to the theater and actually watching plays and would have seen Shakespeare perform. That's really the difference between highbrow and lowbrow, and that's naturally going to be reflected in our literature. So there's a time in which, snobby rich people, middle class people looked down on the kind of books that working class and lower middle class people would read as essentially lowbrow entertainment for people who were not all that educated. That really changed in the United States with the popularity of Mark Twain, and then slightly later than that, the works of Stephen Crane. Twain and Stephen Crane write about poor Americans, and they write about poor Americans in a way that makes them proper subjects for literature. Part of the snobbishness for literature suggested that, real works of literature were about, wealthy people and who had, the problems of educated people and felt things deeply emotionally, and they assumed that the poor and the working class didn't have these kind of emotional reactions. But Mark Twain and Stephen Crane essentially break that mold, and they begin writing what has to be taken as serious works of literature with artistic intent about people about whom literature had never been written before. And so this kind of, in American history, American literary history, this kind of breaks through that barrier that existed between highbrow and lowbrow, and we begin to see this has its effect on American literature, much as, changes in art had their effect on American artists and the way the things American artists painted. The same thing became true about American writers. Well, in the early 20th century, late 19th century, the publishing industry got another boost by improvements in printing technology that allowed, not only could we manufacture paper more cheaply, but now we could actually print and bind books and magazines more cheaply. And so that's why in the 1920s in the United States, I'm going to call it the 1920s, we see this explosion of magazines and books and writers. This is one reason why a lot of the writers we consider to be, part of the American literary canon began publishing in the 1920s. writers I feature on my channel quite often: Hemingway, Faulkner, Dos Passos, Fitzgerald, Willa Cather. These authors begin to publish and begin to be noticed. And I'm not saying their work isn't quality, but what I am saying is that many of them might not have had the opportunity to publish before this printing technology made publication so much cheaper. We begin to see magazines with pictures. We begin to see pulp magazines, that become markets for this kind of pulp fiction ideas that we see, which, a lot of people, I think, today would still kind of label as trash. So with that advent in printing technology and publication becoming more cheap, what we see is then that more books are being published, and publishers begin trying to make money by having their books appeal to all different kinds of groups. This breaks down the highbrow, the lowbrow. This contributes to, and is contributed to, by modernism, which attempt to do away with the idea that there were improper subjects for literature. That one of the modernist ideas is you could write a work of literature about anything, whether it was war or insanity or sex or murder or whatever it was. You could write a piece of literature about anything. And that's really what modernists begin to do. Well, that then begins to kind of change things. And we begin to see the publishing industry kind of branch out and publish more and more stuff and become more intentionally commercial. When TV, etc., came along and people had more free time, for a brief period of time, authors were kind of like celebrities. Have you ever seen a video clip of Gore Vidal or James Baldwin or others on the Dick Cavett show or those other television shows? Writers became kind of celebrities in the 1950s, 60s, and then began to fade away in the 1970s because television kind of perhaps took us away from those things, and maybe television for a time replaced what we thought of as lowbrow literature or lowbrow entertainment. Might argue that the internet did the exact same thing, and that we're seeing the evolution of the internet and division between more elevated educational things and more purely trashy things maybe that we think about, and those being proliferated on the internet, etc. But this is all kind of part of this continuum. And one of the things that I kind of grab onto as kind of something that I think is important is to remind myself that the very authors who I think thought of when I was in college as great American writers who produced great works of literature, there were people who thought of them as lowbrow entertainment. That our standards change all the time about what literature is and what highbrow, lowbrow, middlebrow, trash is. That those standards change all the time, and to me, the fact that standards shift in that way indicates that we probably should reject standards like that in the first place. That we shouldn't necessarily worry about whether or not what we're reading is highbrow, lowbrow, middlebrow, trash. We should just read the things that make us happy. We should resist looking at YouTube channels as being, channels that are talking about serious books, maybe like, some of the channels in our corner of BookTube versus the channels that primarily discuss YA. That in effect, that is a form of snobbishness that we should try to avoid at least introducing to our thinking about BookTube, because it reflects that old style of snobbishness. I'm not blaming Gina for this at all. Gina's great. She's not saying that. But I'm saying that this is one of those things that maybe we should think about in terms of BookTube. I'm not saying you have to consume BookTube channels from all these different kinds of channels that read books that you're not interested in. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying maybe we should, be careful with our attitude towards those channels and towards the books that they read. And in regard to that, in regard to the idea of getting away with book snobbery and BookTube snobbery, I think GarbAugust is just a great idea, because you have all these channels, celebrating essentially the reading of what they are labeling as garbage or trash, regardless of what their definition is. And so, even though I'm not participating in GarbAugust, a shout out to GarbAugust and all its content creators and all the people participating and all its sponsors for doing what I think is a good work of trying to eliminate book snobbery and snobbery here on BookTube. Anyway, again, I'm not sure that made complete sense or was original at all, but if you watched all the way through the end, thank you, and I look forward to your comments in the comment section below.